Hello. Earlier today we had a day-long seminar on Greek mythology at work, and it's put me in a very good mood. And so I thought I would celebrate by recording a story from Greek mythology, and in this occasion it's a story I've not told before, so it's a dry run for me, if you like. So do bear with me if it's a little bit badly told. I've chosen it because it reflects some of the themes, some of the ideas we were discussing in the seminar of important issues within ancient Greek religion and culture. And it's the tale of Ixion. Long ago, Ixion fell madly in love with Dia. She was beautiful and charming and elegant and witty and sophisticated, and he could not ask for a better wife. And better than all of that, all of the charm and the beauty and the wit, and it has to be said, the wealth, was the fact that she loved horses as much as Ixion himself loved horses. He was a passionate rider, a racer, a horse breeder who could admire a fetlock and the flow of a mane from half a mile away and tell one breed of horse from another and trace the lineages back generation after generation. There was nothing that Ixion did not know about horses. And having wooed and charmed many women and come to realise that they were bored to tears with horses, the fact that he now found one who shared his love of all things equine was, well, a blessing from the gods themselves. And so he went to Dia's father. He went to Dionysus and put his case to the old man. He said, I have fallen madly for your daughter, I wish to marry her. And as was the standard practice of the day, old Dionysus, well, ummed and yahed, and they drank a few crates of Retsina, and over a great long and elaborate lunch, they finally struck a bargain. Because it has to be said, in ancient Greece, feminism had yet to arrive, and so during a marriage, it wasn't simply down to the wishes and the whims of the bride and the groom, it was down to the contracts made between the respective families. There were bride prices to be paid. The prospective groom had to give something to the family of his prospective bride in order as an exchange in order to make the contract of the two. And so what Ixion promised to old Dionysus was the gift of 3 of his best horses to be passed over in exchange for the beautiful young woman he wished to marry. The wedding took place, the priest was called, the blessings were made, a great feast, a great banquet was held afterwards. Everything went off splendidly, except for the fact that old Dionysus didn't get his horses. He hung around and he hung around and he hung around and became, as the Japanese are wont to say, like a guest who after 3 days smells as badly as a fish after 3 days. He became such a nuisance that eventually even he realised he had to leave. He couldn't keep hanging around, in the hope that his now son-in-law would remember the 3 horses that had to be passed over as gifts, and it wasn't for want of leaden hints being dropped during the course of his meetings with the man who was now his son-in-law. So, come the day when Dionysus had to go home, he couldn't drag it out any longer, he decided that what wasn't freely given, as per the contract, it was only fair for him to take. He was owed 3 horses, there was a paddock full of horses. Why should he not take what his son-in-law had promised? And so, even without the knowledge of his son-in-law, he went and selected what to him seemed the 3 best horses, although he was nowhere near as expert a judge of horseflesh as his now son-in-law, or indeed as his own daughter. Well, but he chose his 3 favourite horses and off he went with them. When his daughter and son-in-law returned from their honeymoon, they discovered 3 horses missing, and Ixion was livid. It was down to him to decide which 3 horses to give, and the fact that he had decided not to give any at all, to welch on the bargain, to him seemed hardly an issue at all. And so he plotted and he planned and he fumed. And all without the knowledge of his new wife. He invited his father-in-law over to discuss perhaps swapping those 3 horses for better horses. And the old man arrived eager to be given what this true expert on horseflesh would regard as 3 better horses. Not that he was unhappy with the horses he'd taken, but, if his son-in-law was willing to hand over the horses and make this contract a more willing one, then what could be better as far as the old man was concerned? So he came to the house with the 3 horses in tow, in all innocence. He was welcomed in by the servants, wine was brought, bread was brought, olives were brought. Everything seemed to be going swimmingly until his son-in-law came into the reception room of the great house. And there, as was standard within these great reception rooms, there was a large fire pit within the house, filled with hot coals, for whilst some of us may dissolve in the merest heat, being a bit ginger, there are others who live up the mountainsides where it is a little colder and more unpleasant, and they succumb to the cold more quickly, so they need the extra heat, and it's also used for cooking meats and turning them on spits over the burning coals. And as soon as Ixion beckoned his father-in-law to follow him deeper into the house, they had to walk past the coal pit, which the servants had already got fired up, and the coals were blazing away. And before the poor old man knew what was happening, Ixion had shoved him headlong into the coals, and there he writhed and screamed and howled as the coals set fire to his clothing, set fire to his hair, burnt their way into his flesh, and as much as the old man struggled to get off, young Ixion, being by far the stronger of the 2, held him down with pokers and prevented him from getting off the hot coals until the poor old man died, screaming to the high heavens. Well, you can imagine that the debate between husband and wife that evening was a colourful one, to put it mildly. But there was an even more colourful debate taking place. For in agreeing to the marriage, Ixion had acquired a father-in-law. And a father-in-law, whilst not a blood relation, nonetheless is still kin. And there is no crime greater amongst the people of ancient Greece, and many other cultures too, it has to be said, than the slaying of your own kin. This was a crime that cried to the high heavens, that cried to the very court of Olympus itself. And the gods, in their judgment, visited a madness upon Ixion. Plagued by his own guilt, he became stranger and stranger and stranger and lost his mind. When his wife found out what had happened to her own father, when she went and told all of the other people in the neighbourhood, and they told others, and the story rippled out not just amongst the peasantry, but amongst the highborn as well. All of the neighbouring lords and ladies, the well-born and the wealthy, who might have come to Ixion's aid, who might have performed the necessary cleansing ceremonies, the pharmakoi, to purge Ixion of his sin, of his blood guilt upon his hands, were so horrified, they were so disgusted by what they had heard, that not only had he murdered his kin, but he had murdered that kin when the kin had been a guest in his house, which is a double crime, a double sin. For alongside kinslaying, the murder of a guest is xenia, violation of the law of xenia, the law of hospitality. And not only could the gods not forgive either of these crimes, but neither could his friends and neighbours, so they cast him out, and he wandered far and wide, going madder and madder, stranger and stranger, seemingly doomed to never escape the fate that he had brought upon himself. And having told you that the gods could not forgive this crime, there was one god who's strange to tell, and the reason for his forgiveness is unknown. Because of all of the gods least likely to forgive the violation of Xania, of host law, Zeus is that god. For to him, the law of Xania is supreme. He is the god who is least likely to forgive its violation. Yet on this occasion, and for reasons which I dare not speculate upon, he took pity upon Ixion. He drew him up to Olympus to take part in a feast with the gods, perhaps to help heal his madness, to wash away his blood guilt. And there the gods of Olympus, Artemis, Apollo, Athena, Poseidon, all of the others had gathered with their entourage of demigods and assistants and servants at the great banqueting halls of Olympus, which stretch as long as 3 football pitches, with tables laden with every conceivable food you might wish for, and many you could probably not begin to imagine in the first place. And there they wined and they dined long into the night. But Zeus noticed almost immediately that his mortal guest sat down at that great banqueting table. He had eyes not for the groaning quantities of food, not for the great flowing tides of wine, not for the architecture, not for the livery of the servants, or the glorious jewellery and dress of the people bedecked out at this great gathering, but eyes only for Zeus's own wife, for the stately, matronly Hera. And this upstart guest seemed to think it his right, his place, to sit not at the far end of the table, but to sit adjacent to Zeus's own wife, to the queen of the gods. And this seemed to Zeus too much. And so he took that upstart king on a tour around the great palace of Olympus. And while this tour was taking place, Zeus worked his own little magic. And where his wife had been sitting, he created from the very clouds themselves, because Olympus is so high, the clouds form a protective blanket that shields Olympus from the mortals and vice versa. And so it was one of these protective layers of cloud that Zeus drew with his magic into the palace of Olympus, and shifted and turned and shaped like a sculptor moulding clay, shaped that cloud into the exact and perfect duplicate of his own wife Hera, and placed her in a seat at the banqueting table. And all the while he kept Ixion talking and talking and pointing out this feature and that feature within the great palace of Olympus, so he did not notice the substitution of the cloud version of Hera for the real version of Hera. And at length they came back to the table, and Zeus seated Ixion next to what he in his own mind called Nephele, the cloud woman. And then Zeus went back to his own seat at the great table and watched with a weary eye to see if his host really was going to do the thing that Zeus had come to expect him to do. And lo and behold, he did. For as the man got drunker and drunker, his hands began to wander in the direction of this fake Hera. He began to woo her, to charm her, to touch her in all sorts of highly inappropriate places for a goddess. And had she been the real Hera, then the mountain would have quaked with her response. And it's fortunate for the mountain and all of the poor goats living upon it that it was not the real Hera. But nonetheless it was the real Zeus. And when he saw what was happening, Zeus leapt into a state of fury. Raging and thundering, he pushed the offending Ixion down out of Olympus, and he tumbled and he tumbled and he tumbled and he tumbled, and he fell into the very bowels of Hades, and through Hades he fell and he fell still until he landed in the pits of Tartarus, and there he was chained to a wheel. A wheel set forever spinning and spinning and spinning, so that he should neither know whether he was on his head nor his heels, as if all of the intoxicating wines of Olympus would keep him perpetually drunk and the room perpetually turning, and for all we know he spins there still. And whilst it is almost the end of this story, it is not quite, for there is one last thing to tell. For Nephele, the cloud imitation of Hera, was not yet done, not yet dissipated upon the mists, for in his groping and his fondling and his drunken advances upon what he thought was the goddess, Ixion had somehow, and let us not think too much about the technicalities of how he managed this, but somehow had managed to impregnate the Cloud Woman. And Zeus, when he realised this, stepped back and let the Cloud Woman continue until such time as she had given birth. And when she had given birth, she dissipated upon the mists and went back to being a cloud. And the child she gave birth to was a strange and misbegotten thing. The poor lad was nicknamed Centaurus, and he looked as if he were a union of strange and different beasts jammed together. He was malformed and hunched and peculiar and strange, but of a tender and gentle heart. And do bear that in mind when you take into account that because of his appearance, not of his heart, but of his outward appearance, the rest of the world, the land of the mortals amongst whom he had gone to live, shunned him. They turned him away, they cast him out, they drove him up the mountainsides to live in isolation as a hermit. And whilst it is an unpleasant topic for conversation, loneliness will drive men and women to the strangest of habits and practices. And Centaurus, who was fathered by a horse-loving parent, retained that love of horses, but took it to a level which his father never had. And without getting into too many graphic details, he found companionship with the mares who lived on the mountainside, even as he could find no companionship with humankind. And it was from the union of Centaurus and the various horses of the mountain that eventually the centaurs were born, a mixture of half horse and half human, and most of them filled with the same drunken, passionate, furious nature that had driven their grandfather Ixion to his many foolish and unwise actions. There was one particularly wise centaur, the gentle Chiron, but his tale is another one, and this is the end of this one. Thank you.